Good morning. Welcome to those of you who are visiting. I see some unfamiliar faces. I'm glad that you decided to be with us this morning. We are studying in the book of 2 Corinthians, and we have today and next Sunday to complete our study, or at least to complete our overview. That's kind of what we're left with at this point in the last parts of the book. We were in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 last week, and I just have a few remarks to make about the latter part of that chapter. In chapters 8 and 9, Paul was talking about the work of benevolence towards the Christians who were in Jerusalem. And of course, Paul is in the Greek world and the Asian world, and he is going to these churches, and he is in preaching the gospel there. Part of what he is doing is also arranging for a collection of money to be carried to Jerusalem to aid with the poor and afflicted in Jerusalem. And so in chapter 8 and 9 here in 2 Corinthians, Paul is reminding the Corinthians of a commitment they had made to participate in this work, and encourages them to do that. And he compares or explains to them the work of the churches of Macedonia and their completion of this work, and then is encouraging them to complete this work also. And we really stopped around the end of around verse 5 of chapter 9. So I want to look at what he says with regard to their attitude towards giving. And I think there's a little bit that needs to be said about that that is so applicable, I think, today and in every age as we think about what do we do with the things that God has given us, and what are our responsibilities in that regard. And so I want to talk about that just briefly, and then we'll get into chapters 10 through 12 following that. So Paul is encouraging them to fulfill an earlier commitment. And Paul had been bragging to other churches about the church at Corinth and the churches of Achaia and their willingness to participate in this work. They were the first ones to participate, the first ones to engage in it. But now a year has passed since they began. We read in 1 Corinthians Paul's instructions to them about this collection. If you'll recall, you can go there and read about that in the first part of chapter 16. He gives them instructions about laying by and store each week for this effort, each first day of the week. And now it is time to complete this, and men will be coming. Titus and two other men are going to be coming to Corinth to help them complete this work and gather this money so it can be carried to Jerusalem. But Paul says in verse 6, he says, "Now this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must do just as he has purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. As it is written, he scattered abroad, he gave to the poor, his righteousness endures forever." And that is from Psalm 112. We'll be looking at that here in a moment. "Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God." So I think there needs to be some explanation. Doesn't require a lot here. But Paul clearly makes the statement that if you sow bountifully, you will also reap bountifully. Now, there are those in the Christian world, and I use that in the loosest sense, who preach a gospel of prosperity. That is, if you believe in God, God will make you rich. And if you give, God will make you even richer. That's not what this passage is teaching at all. In fact, it's kind of almost teaching the opposite of that. He says, he who sows sparingly will reap sparingly. Well, that seems to make sense. If you don't sow a lot of seed, not a lot will come from it. Not a lot will grow. And the seed in this case is their benevolence. And what will grow will be, in this passage, thankfulness to God. What is going to be reaped here? Thankfulness of God, the benefit of those who are receiving. He says, each one must do as he's purposed in his heart. We understand that. I don't want to take a lot of time on that. I will only to say this. I've had conversations with people where we talk about the Old Testament had the tithe. Are we subject to the tithe today? And of course, you recall what the tithe was. The tithe was you were to give 10% of everything you're blessed with to God. Are we subject to the tithe now? No, we're subject to this. We're subject to this. Each one must do as he has purposed in his heart. Purpose in your heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion. The tithe was compulsory, wasn't it? Give 10%. Here he says, you're not under compulsion to give. Give as you have purposed in your heart, which is a higher standard. For someone to say to you, you must give 10%, or for someone to say to you, give what you think you should give. That second is a much higher standard. I can give for 10% and be grudgingly about it. Here he says, not grudgingly. I can give the tithe. I've completed the 10%, and I'm not really that thrilled with it. Here he says, don't give grudgingly. Don't give some number that you think you have to give. Give what your heart says you should give. Much more difficult standard. In other words, you'll be judged by what you purposed in your heart. And remember, we mentioned last week the widow who gave the mite. It was a small number. It was the smallest number possible. But she gave more than anyone because of her heart. And that is the standard. So how much you give isn't going to get you some reward, but the heart with which you give. The heart that determines the amount. The heart that exposes the thoughts of your minds and your motives. That's the standard. But then he goes on to say, he goes back to this idea of sowing bountifully and reaping bountifully. He says, God is able to make all grace abound to you so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. So, in other words, you don't have to worry about what you have. God will give you everything necessary for you to do what you should do, for you to abound in every good deed. God will supply what you need so that you can do this good thing. Now, that's very different than what James says in James chapter 4, in verse 4, where James says, you ask, but you do not receive, because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend it on your pleasures. See, James says, if you're wanting God's blessings so you can just go spend it on yourself, that's why you're not receiving anything. But here in this passage, Paul is saying, if you intend to do good, God will supply your needs in order to accomplish that. Turn over to Psalm 112, because he then quotes Psalm 112. And as we've said, Paul refers to the book of Isaiah frequently over and over in this letter, and he refers to the Psalms over and over, and here he does it again. And Psalm 112, because he goes on to say, as it is written, he scattered abroad, he gave to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. If you read that quotation from Paul, you would probably think that he's referring to God, that this quotation is about God. He scattered abroad, he gave to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. That's God, right? No, that's not who that's referring to. If you look at Psalm 112, it begins with, praise the Lord, how blessed is the man who fears the Lord, who greatly delights in his commands. That's who the psalmist is talking about. The man blessed by God because he fears the Lord. And here's that phrase, fears the Lord, which we've already seen recently in this letter that we're studying, 2 Corinthians. Paul talks about the fear of the Lord. Well, here he brings the fear of the Lord in, but he's talking about what is the character, what is the behavior of the one who fears in the Lord and who delights in his commandments. Well, he goes on to say several things. His descendants will be mighty on the earth. The generation of the upright will be blessed. Wealth and riches are in his house. His righteousness endures forever. Meaning his life, his good life that he lived in the sunshine of the Lord is going to endure. Light arises in the darkness for the upright. He is gracious and compassionate and righteous. It is well with the man who is gracious and lends. He will maintain his cause in judgment. He will never be shaken. The righteous will be remembered forever. He's describing this man who fears the Lord. He says in verse 7, he will not fear evil tidings. His heart is steadfast, trusting in the Lord. His heart is upheld. He will not fear until he looks with satisfaction on his adversaries. In other words, he will get the best of his enemies. And then verse 9 is where we get our quotation from. He who, this man who fears the Lord, he has given freely to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. His horn will be exalted in honor. So what is the man who fears the Lord? What does he do? He gives freely to the poor. And that's the point Paul is making to these Corinthians when he quotes this verse. Give freely to the poor. Give as you have purposed. Give according to your ability. Or like the churches of Macedonia, he says, beyond their ability. He says, now he who supplies the seed to the sower and bread for food. So God who provides the very seed that we sow, the bread that we eat, will increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in everything. What? For all liberality. You will be increased in everything for all liberality. In other words, that you might give it away. See how different that is than what James says? You ask and do not receive. For you ask with wrong motives, that you might spend it on your pleasures. And here Paul says, he who provides the seed to the sower and bread for food will bless you in all liberality. In other words, that you might give it away. And then he says the real fruit of this harvest is that through us it is producing thanksgivings to God, for the ministry of this service is not fully supplying the needs of the saints, but is overflowing through many thanksgivings to God because of the proof given in this ministry. And he's referring to this effort, this effort of benevolence, because the proof given by this ministry, they will glorify God for your obedience to your confession of the gospel of Christ, and for the liberality of your contribution to them and to all, while they also, by prayer on your behalf, yearn for you because of the surpassing grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for this indescribable gift. So what is the reward? The reward is that these people will know that this gift is born out of God's grace upon the Corinthians, and they will give thanks and pray for the Corinthians and give thanks for the grace and gift that they have provided. So there's our motivation. We don't give because God's going to make us rich because we gave more. We give because it is our service to God to create thanksgiving and show the grace of God towards us given to others. So, chapter 10, the tenor of this letter takes a pretty dramatic turn. Although there is a transition here where Paul has brought up this subject of them completing this work, he turns to chapters 10 through 12, and the tone changes. And I want you to think for a moment, the tone changes so much. There are those in scholarly circles who think this must have been some other letter that got mashed together with this one, but I don't think there's any basis for saying that, honestly. Paul has been addressing more than one group of people throughout this letter. And I'll remind you who those people are. There are those who he spoke of in chapter 7 who had received his previous letter, whether that is 1 Corinthians or a letter in between. They have received his previous letter and had, in response to it, repented with a godly sorrow and had, in fact, comforted Titus to the point that Titus was encouraged, and Paul, through Titus's encouragement and comfort, was comforted himself. And he praises them greatly, this group that has received the letter, who have received the teaching of Paul, who've repented unto godly sorrow. But there are two other groups of people at Corinth. The first is those who had not yet repented. I think a smaller group, a subset of the church there, which were still being influenced by the third group, and that is these super apostles who had come in to the church and were stirring up antagonism towards Paul. So when we get to chapters 10, 11, and 12, Paul is primarily turning his attention and his teaching to these second and third groups, and primarily to the third. And it's almost like, sometimes you're talking to two people and you're trying to say what you're saying to one, but you're really talking to this one. You're addressing this one, but you really want this one to hear what you're saying. And in a way, that's what Paul seems to be doing here. He is speaking to these Corinthian brethren who are still resisting Paul, still listening to these outsiders that Paul refers to as the super apostles in chapter 11 and chapter 12. These fake apostles, we're going to read about them in just a moment. Paul is really directly attacking them, but he is addressing himself to the Corinthians who are listening to them. And Paul is very direct. This section of this letter is full of irony and sarcasm. You can't miss, sarcasm is one of those dangerous things. I've seen people refer to Scripture as sarcastic that I didn't really think was sarcastic. You can't miss it here. If you miss it here, you'll completely misunderstand what Paul is saying. Paul is extremely sarcastic and extremely ironic in this section. His words are harsh in that way. But why are they? Well, in chapter 12, we're going to skip way towards the end of this argument. Chapter 11, verse 12. Paul says, "But what I am doing, I will continue to do." Now, this is during this section where he's making these comments. He says, "What I am doing, I will continue to do, so that I may cut off opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the matter about which they are boasting. For such men are false prophets, or false apostles rather. False prophets, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ." And we're reminded there of the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 7 and verse 15, where he says, "Beware of wolves dressed as sheep." And here he talks about those who are disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. "No wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Therefore it is not surprising if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness, whose end will be according to their deeds." So these are the people that Paul is speaking about in this section. He refers to them as the servants of Satan, who have disguised themselves as servants of righteousness, but in reality, they are false prophets, deceitful workers, and they are the servants of Satan. So that's why he's really addressing these people the way he is. So I think I do have slides. I always forget them, but let's see. So I do want to review something we have to do this very quickly. We don't really have enough time to do it, but if you'll recall from our our second class. This is a slide from that class. And we pointed out the Corinthians' criticisms of Paul. One, his unwillingness to boast. Two, his and that first one sounds kind of paradoxical to us. It makes sense. I mean, we don't really think people boasting is a good thing, but they did, and we'll see that in just a moment. His unwillingness to boast, his unimpressive physical appearance, his inferior speech. He wasn't a great orator. It doesn't mean he couldn't talk, but he wasn't, by comparison to the great Roman and Greek orators that were so highly regarded, he wasn't a great speaker in that regard. And four, his unwillingness to accept financial support from the Corinthian church. And we went through and made the case for each of these things, explaining why these are so important to the people in Corinth. And what you'll notice from the verses that I have beside each of those, all of those things are directly addressed in this section of the letter. It's very clear when you look at this and then you read through this section, just sit down and read it. All of these things rise to the surface very clearly. But this one, boasting, and if you recall, I think, those two slides are out of order. But so here's the first one. In the Hellenistic age, and in Corinth particularly, self-appreciation became the goal and self-glorification the reward. There was a competition for honor. Correspondingly, there was a disdain for humility. And we know this because when we look at the ruins of Corinth, there are many stone carvings, which, epitaphs, etc., that made it very clear how people bragged about themselves. And then I had several quotes. It is the mark of a foolish person to be ashamed to praise himself. This is a famous, we have a lot of information about him, a famous Greek and Roman orator, philosopher, writer, who was contemporary with Paul. He's describing what they valued in their... Again, Lucian, also a little bit after Paul. The humble-witted are neither sought by their friends nor feared by their enemies, but are ever cringing to the man above. Then Dio Cassius, another second century Roman historian, Roman senator, he says, no one of a servile background can develop any great pride. In other words, what a shame that your beginning was so humble that you can't muster up some pride. That's the attitude of these people. Both Greeks and Romans spurn any posture or gesture which amounts to a reduction in personal worth. And that's from Origen, a Christian writer of the 2nd and 3rd century. Most people think that to be deprived the chance to display wealth is to be deprived of wealth itself. Plutarch, you've probably heard of from the 1st and 2nd century. The man who lives in a fine house gets no good of it, nor of his ivory or gold either, unless someone admires it all. And again, that is Lucian. So this is the environment in which Paul is talking about. And you'll see there that Paul uses the word boast 39 times in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. So that's why I'm taking the time to go through this example here, because why on earth is he using this word so much over and over and kind of apologizing and making it clear that he's using it and doing it in a very accommodative way? Because that was the culture that these people lived in. And one of their criticism is, Paul just seemed so humble. And that was perceived as something was wrong with you. You were not up to snuff that's an old phrase. You were not up to it if you didn't brag on yourself. So when we're in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and 12, and we see this boasting, if you don't understand that, this section will be confusing to you. So it's very important when you go and study this book that you have that in mind. So I'm going to hurry through the rest of this and chapters 10. We're not going to finish chapter 12. I'd like to get through most of chapter 12, but we're going to have to just kind of hit some highlights and some key verses here, just so you understand and the path that Paul is on here. He begins in chapter 10 and verse 1. He says, Now I, Paul, myself, urge you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I who am meek when face to face with you, but bold toward you when absent. Now that phrase there, when he parenthetically inserts that, I who am meek when face to face, is really, that phrase is explained better in chapter 10 and verse 10 when he elaborates. He says, for they say, that is, those who are accusing Paul, they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his personal presence is unimpressive and his speech contemptible. Now, you recognize that from that list of criticisms that I put up on the screen a moment ago. But he's referring to that here in verse 1. He says, I who am meek when face to face with you, but bold toward you when absent. That's their accusation. But how does Paul begin addressing that? He says, I urge you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. The meekness and gentleness of Christ. So I guess Christ is deserving of your criticism also. Because Christ was meek and gentle. And this gentleness really kind of has the idea of gentle in judgment. You know, that in dealing with people, gentle in how harsh or how soft you deal with people. And Paul is in fact saying, I'm trying my hardest to deal with you gently. As Christ deals with all of us, gently. And if you think I am meek, what do you think of Christ? And so he begins with this suggestion. And then he goes on and says, because they are accusing him, I should read this because the quote I have up there doesn't have it all. He says, I ask that when I am present, I need not to be bold with the confidence with which I propose to be courageous against some. And he uses the word some here. He's going to use the word some again later. And so you see that he is making it clear that he's referring to some people in the church. This is not applying to everybody, he says, but for some. He says, I propose to come and deal with some of you. And I hope that you don't force me to deal with you with that level of boldness and courage. I would like that not to be the case. He says, but they regard us as if we walked according to the flesh. He says, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. And we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Paul says they're looking at us and say that we walk according to the flesh. He says, well, they're right. We are in the flesh. We are human beings. And we suffer things as human beings. And he's already talked about that a lot in this letter. We suffer as human beings. We are not invincible to the slings and arrows of this world. He says, but our warfare is not according to the world, but is divinely powerful. In this beautiful verse, destroying speculations and every lofty thing. He's referring to them. Their speculations and their lofty things raised up against the knowledge of God. In 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 34, he accused many of the Corinthians of being without the knowledge of God. And here he says the knowledge of God is key. We are taking every thought, and you could translate that every mind, but there's really the same idea. The thoughts that come from the mind. We're taking captive. In other words, in our warfare, we are taking captive the minds of men, the thoughts of men, to the obedience of Christ, and are ready to punish all disobedience whenever your obedience is complete. And then he says, really what their problem is. You're looking at things outwardly. You're looking at things according to the flesh. And he's talked about this over and over, but here he plainly says, the problem here is that you're looking at things outwardly. He says, let such a person consider this, verse 11, that what we are in word by letters when we are absent, such persons we also are also in deed when present. So he concludes this paragraph. He begins by challenging their assertion, and then he answers it directly here at the end of the paragraph. He says, who we are in our letters, we'll be that in deed and when we're in person. And this is the first volley of Paul's threats against them, that when he comes, if these things still are a problem, he will address them. Then he makes this assertion about these people. He says, and he starts here to kind of look towards this idea of boasting. He says, we are not bold to class or compare ourselves with some of those who commend themselves when they are, but when they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are without understanding. He says, we're not trying to compare ourselves to these people who boast about themselves, who commend themselves, and they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves. What is all that saying? He's simply saying they have made themselves the standard. They look at themselves and, hey, I'm pretty good. We're really, they have commended themselves and they have bragged about themselves as though that were the standard. And Paul says in verse 13, but we will not boast beyond our measure, but within the measure of the sphere which God appointed us to us as a measure. In other words, we're going to use God as our measure and the work that God has given us and whether or not we're accomplishing the work. He uses the word sphere here several times, and he's simply talking about the work, the circle in which Paul is working, the work that God has given him to do. He says, we will look inside the sphere which God apportioned to us as a measure. Are we doing God's work? For we are not overextending ourselves as if we did not reach to you. For we were the first to come, even as far as you in the gospel of Christ, not boasting beyond our measure, that is, in other men's labors, but with the hope that as your faith grows, we will be within our sphere enlarged more by you. In other words, go back to chapter 3 when Paul says, do we need letters to commend ourselves? No, for you are our letter, written on human hearts. And here he says the same thing. We don't need to boast about ourselves. We just look at the sphere of our work. And as you grow in your faith, we will, within our sphere, enlarge even more by you, so as to preach the gospel even to regions beyond you, and not to boast in what has been accomplished in the sphere of another. And then he says in verse 17, but he who boasts is to boast in the Lord. And there he quotes Jeremiah chapter 9 and verse 24. For it is not he who commends himself that is approved, but he whom the Lord commends. In Jeremiah chapter 9 verses 23 it says, let not a wise man boast of his wisdom, and let not the mighty man boast of his might, and let not the rich man boast of his riches. He's describing the culture of Corinth perfectly there. But let him who boast of this, that he understands and knows me, the knowledge of God. That I am the Lord who exercises loving kindness, justice, and righteousness on the earth, for I delight in these things, declares the Lord. So the fuller context of Jeremiah 9 speaks perfectly to Paul's argument here. We only have a couple more minutes. So it is not he who commends himself that is approved, but he whom the Lord commends. Chapter 11, which we're obviously not going to cover with any great depth here. Chapter 11 is kind of thought of, I think of as like Paul's foolish speech. He says, I wish that you would bear with me with a little foolishness and a little foolishness. And here's where Paul's sarcasm becomes great. And Paul explains his reason for doing this. He says, I'm afraid that your minds will be led astray for the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. There's an entire lesson in that verse. He says, this is simple. Your devotion to Christ and to who he was and how he lived That's what we're striving for, and we're worried with all these things around you that you're going to be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion in Christ. So next week, I would encourage you to read chapter 11, where Paul gives this great speech where he describes everything that he went through. You can read where he talks about the boasting there. Read through that, because we're going to skip to chapter 12 and get the latter part of chapter 12 and verse 13 next week in Paul's summary. All right, thank you very much.
Son of my soul, thou Savior dear, it is not night if thou be near. O may no earth-born cloud arise to hide thee from thy servant.